Hey guys, tonight we begin with why it absolutely sucked to be a monk during the Black Death. And, I mean really sucked in ways that would make your worst Monday morning look like a spa vacation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into medieval misery. Let's start with the biggest misconception about medieval monks during plague times. Most people picture them as these serene, wise figures gliding peacefully through monastery halls, chanting Latin while somehow magically immune to worldly troubles. Maybe you imagine them like that monk from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, jolly, rotund, and inexplicably good at fighting despite supposedly dedicating their lives to prayer and contemplation, not in reality. Monks during the Black Death were more like healthcare workers, social workers, therapists, economists, farmers, teachers, and undertakers all rolled into one terrified package, except they had absolutely zero medical training, no understanding of disease transmission, and their primary qualification was knowing how to read Latin. This wasn't some peaceful spiritual retreat where they got to contemplate the divine while growing vegetables and copying manuscripts. It was more like being the only emergency response team in a zombie apocalypse. Except the zombies were your friends and family slowly dying of bubonic plague, and your main tools were prayer, some questionable herbal remedies, and the unwavering belief that this was all somehow God's plan. Think of it this way. Imagine being a librarian who suddenly gets promoted to head of the CDC during a pandemic. Except you don't know what germs are. Antibiotics won't be invented for another 600 years. And your boss, God, communicates exclusively through cryptic signs that might be miracles or might just be coincidences. That was basically a monk's job description in 1347. The 14th century wasn't exactly what you call the good old days. Unless your idea of good times involves no indoor plumbing, a life expectancy of about 35, and the constant threat of death by everything from infected splinters to angry nobles. Medieval Europe wasn't some romantic Camelot situation with noble knights and fair maidens. It was more like if Game of Thrones happened in real life, but with worse hygiene and even more random deaths. Monasteries controlled massive amounts of land, wealth, and political influence, making them essentially the Amazon of medieval Europe. If Amazon also handled your spiritual salvation, ran the hospitals, educated you children, and buried your dead, they weren't just religious institutions. They were economic powerhouses, political players, and the closest thing to social services that existed. If you thought modern megacorporations had their fingers in too many pies, medieval monasteries literally controlled everything from beer production to international banking. The Catholic Church dominated every aspect of life so completely that questioning church doctrine wasn't just heresy. It was basically social suicide. Monasteries were like franchises of this massive spiritual corporation, each one responsible for maintaining order, providing charity, preserving knowledge, and convincing everyone that suffering was actually good for their souls. Think of monks as middle management in the world's largest and most powerful organization, except their performance reviews were conducted by an invisible boss who might send you to hell for eternity if you messed up. And if you thought navigating office politics was complicated. Try being a monk when your daily responsibilities included managing vast agricultural estates, maintaining complex political relationships with local nobles, copying ancient texts by hand, providing medical care with the medical knowledge of a medieval peasant, and oh yeah, saving souls while the world literally ended around you. Meet Brother Thomas of Walsingham, not to be confused with Thomas, a Kempis, or any of the other dozen famous medieval Thomases, because apparently medieval parents had the creativity of modern Hollywood sequels. Thomas wasn't particularly special when he joined Walsingham Priory in Norfolk around 1340. He was a younger son from a minor noble family, basically medieval spare parts, who chose monastic life because it beat starving as a landless knight. Or becoming a particularly unsuccessful merchant. Thomas thought he was signing up for a life of peaceful scholarship, regular meals, and the kind of job security that comes with serving an eternal employer. The recruitment brochure, if you will, probably mentioned the excellent benefits: guaranteed housing, 3 meals a day, comprehensive afterlife insurance, and the respect that comes with being God's representative on earth. What it definitely didn't mention was that he'd spent his career dealing with the medieval equivalent of multiple natural disasters happening simultaneously while people looked to him for answers he absolutely did not have. But here's the twist that makes Thomas's story particularly brutal. He actually kept a chronicle of events at Walsingham during the plague years. So we have a first-hand account of exactly how much it sucked to be him. This guy literally documented his own misery for posterity, like keeping a detailed diary of the worst job in human history. His writings reveal that he went from optimistic young monk to traumatized plague survivor faster than you can say Pax Vobiscum. Thomas watched his monastery's population drop from 67 monks to 12 in less than 2 years. He buried his friends, his mentors, his abbot, and probably wondered daily if tomorrow would be his turn to join the ever-growing cemetery behind the chapel. And through it all, he had to maintain the appearance of serene faith while internally screaming, "What the actual hell is happening?" The consequences of this experience shaped not just Thomas's worldview, but the entire trajectory of medieval monasticism. Imagine surviving the zombie apocalypse and then having to rebuild civilization with the traumatized survivors. That's basically what monks like Thomas faced. Except they also had to maintain their faith in a benevolent God while doing it. This wasn't just about monks having a bad time at work. The Black Death fundamentally challenged everything medieval society believed about divine justice, religious authority, and the natural order of the universe. When God's supposed representatives started dying in droves from the same disease, killing everyone else, it raised some uncomfortable questions about whether anyone was actually in charge upstairs. Monks weren't just individuals suffering. They were the infrastructure holding medieval society together. They ran the hospitals, schools, and orphanages. They maintained the records, preserved the books, and provided the social safety net. When monasteries started failing, entire communities lost their economic anchors, their medical care, their education systems, and their spiritual guidance all at once. It was like if Amazon, Google, the Red Cross, and your local hospital all collapsed simultaneously. The ripple effects were staggering. Peasants who depended on monastic charity faced starvation. Students lost their teachers. The sick lost their caregivers. Local economies collapsed when major land-holding monasteries couldn't maintain their agricultural operations. Political alliances crumbled when powerful abbots died without obvious successors. And perhaps most critically, people lost faith in the very institutions that had promised them salvation and stability. This crisis of authority would eventually contribute to everything from the Protestant Reformation to the rise of secular government. When people watched monks die just as helplessly as everyone else, despite their supposed connection to divine power, it planted seeds of doubt that would eventually bloom into major religious and political upheavals. The suffering of medieval monks during the Black Death wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a catalyst for the transformation of European civilization. But Brother Thomas and his rapidly diminishing community at Walsingham were just the beginning of this medieval horror story. Across Europe, thousands of monasteries face similar devastation, each with their own tragic tales of faith tested, communities shattered, and individuals pushed beyond human endurance. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It revealed the fragility of everything medieval society thought was permanent and sacred. The daily routine of monastic life during the Black Death transformed from peaceful ritual into a relentless nightmare that would make modern healthcare workers weep with sympathy. Unlike the common assumption that monks just prayed all day while somehow staying mysteriously protected by divine intervention, the reality was that they became the medieval equivalent of emergency responders. Except their emergency lasted for years, and their training consisted entirely of knowing when to ring bells for prayer time. Medieval monasteries operated on a schedule called the Divine Office. 8 prayer services spread throughout each 24-hour period, starting with matins at 2 a.m. and ending with compline before bed. This wasn't just spiritual discipline. It was the entire organizational structure around which monastic communities functioned. Everything from meals to work assignments to recreational time was carefully planned around these prayer services. It was like living in the world's most regimented spiritual boot camp, where God was your drill sergeant and missing formation could literally damn your soul. But when the plague arrived, this carefully orchestrated routine collapsed faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Suddenly, monks found themselves trying to maintain 8 daily prayer services while simultaneously running field hospitals, digging mass graves, managing economic collapse, and watching their brothers die one by one. It was like trying to perform a symphony while the concert hall burned down around you. Technically possible, but not exactly conducive to maintaining your sanity or your faith. The schedule that had provided structure and meaning for centuries became a cruel mockery when half your community was too sick to attend services and the other half was too busy disposing of bodies to care about precise timing. Imagine trying to maintain corporate culture during a zombie apocalypse. That's essentially what medieval monks faced when the Black Death arrived at their doorstep. Take the monastery of St. Albans, one of the wealthiest and most powerful religious houses in England. Before the plague, it housed over 100 monks living in relative comfort, managing vast estates, running successful scriptoriums, and wielding considerable political influence. The abbot lived like a medieval CEO, complete with private apartments, gourmet meals, and the kind of job security that comes with divine appointment. When the Black Death hit St. Albans in 1348, everything went sideways faster than you can say. Memento mori. Within the first month, 17 monks died, not gradually over time, but within weeks of each other. The infirmary, designed to handle maybe 2 or 3 sick monks at a time, suddenly had to accommodate dozens of patients. Imagine a small medical clinic suddenly becoming the only hospital in a major disaster zone. Except their medical supplies consisted of prayer books and some questionable herbal remedies that probably did more harm than good. Brother Matthew Paris, not the chronicler, another Matthew, because medieval naming conventions were apparently as creative as modern boy bands, described how they ran out of holy oil for last rites within the first week. Think about that for a moment. They literally couldn't perform the most important spiritual service for dying monks because they'd never anticipated needing to give last rites to half their community simultaneously. It was like running out of uniforms during military deployment. Technically not fatal, but definitely not helping with morale. The situation got so desperate that they started giving group absolutions instead of individual confessions, essentially creating the medieval equivalent of express lanes for salvation. Monks who had spent years in careful spiritual preparation were getting their final sacraments in bulk, processing sessions that would have horrified their predecessors. One survivor, Brother William, allegedly commented that they were processing souls like wheat at harvest time, which sounds poetic until you realize He was describing the complete breakdown of everything they held sacred. Another documented case involves the monastery at Moor in Yorkshire, where the plague killed 42 out of 43 monks. The sole survivor, Abbot William Burton, found himself running a major religious institution single-handedly while surrounded by empty halls that had once housed a thriving community. Burton's letters reveal a man teetering on the edge of complete psychological breakdown, describing how he would hear phantom bells calling non-existent monks to prayers that no one could attend. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing involving medieval monks and supernatural disasters ever is. The plague created impossible moral dilemmas that would have stumped modern ethicists, let alone medieval religious men, whose moral framework was designed for entirely different circumstances. Many monasteries faced the brutal choice between maintaining their charitable obligations and protecting their surviving members. Monastic rules required them to provide hospitality to travelers and care for the sick, but doing so during a plague was essentially suicide. Some monks chose martyrdom, continuing to care for plague victims until they inevitably contracted the disease themselves. Others chose survival, sealing their monasteries and turning away the desperate people who had always counted on monastic charity. Neither choice was clearly right or wrong, which was particularly devastating for people whose entire worldview was built on the assumption that moral choices were usually obvious if you just followed church teaching. Suddenly, faithful monks found themselves choosing between conflicting religious duties, with no clear guidance from church hierarchy because the bishops were dealing with their own plague-related crises. The economic contradictions were equally brutal. Wealthy monasteries that had relied on income from vast agricultural estates suddenly found themselves with no peasants to work the land. They were all dead, but they still had financial obligations to the church, debts to pay, and surviving monks to feed. Some monasteries became incredibly wealthy because they inherited property from plague victims who left everything to the church, while others faced complete financial collapse because their entire economic foundation disappeared overnight. Modern financial advisors talk about diversified portfolios, but medieval monasteries had literally put all their eggs in the basket of feudal agriculture. When that system collapsed, even the wealthiest religious houses could find themselves facing bankruptcy faster than a dot-com startup during a market crash. The result was a complete transformation of monastic culture that historians are still trying to fully understand. Communities that had maintained the same routines for centuries were forced to improvise new ways of being monks, while everything they had believed about divine protection and religious authority crumbled around them. Many surviving monks suffered what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Brother John of Reading described nightmares where he heard the voices of dead monks calling him to prayer services. Others reported seeing ghostly figures in monastery halls or feeling the presence of their deceased brothers during communal activities. These weren't considered psychological symptoms. They were interpreted as supernatural visitations, which probably didn't help with anyone's mental health. The survivors had to rebuild not just their communities, but their entire understanding of what it meant to be a monk. Monasteries that had once housed 50 or 60 monks suddenly operated with skeletal crews of 5 or 10 survivors. Traditional practices like communal dying became impossible when you didn't have enough people to justify setting the main hall. The elaborate choral services that have been the pride of medieval monasticism turned into pathetic affairs with a handful of voices, echoing in empty spaces designed for much larger communities. Some monks abandoned their vows entirely, deciding that if God wasn't protecting his most faithful servants, maybe the whole system was fundamentally flawed. Others doubled down on religious observance, interpreting their survival as a sign that they were chosen for some special purpose. The psychological toll of being among the few survivors in communities that had seemed permanent and divinely protected cannot be overstated. These men lived through experiences that would challenge anyone's faith and sanity. Institutional reactions varied wildly. Some monastic orders tried to maintain strict traditional practices, insisting that any deviation from established routine was a form of spiritual failure. Others embraced radical reforms, arguing that the plague was God's way of indicating that traditional monasticism needed updating. These conflicting approaches created internal conflicts that lasted for generations, as different factions fought over how to interpret their traumatic experiences. Meanwhile, as surviving monks struggled to maintain some semblance of traditional religious life, the outside world was looking to them for answers and leadership they were completely unprepared to provide. The very people who had always turned to monasteries for spiritual guidance, practical help, and social stability now found themselves facing monks who were just as confused, terrified, and desperate as everyone else. This crisis of authority would prove even more devastating than the immediate physical effects of the plague, as the foundation of medieval religious and social order began to crack under the weight of unanswered prayers and unfulfilled promises of divine protection. If maintaining daily monastic routine during the plague was a nightmare, then fulfilling their charitable obligations was a death trap with a side of moral complexity that would make modern philosophers weep. Medieval monasteries weren't just spiritual retreats. They were the social safety net for entire regions, providing healthcare, education, food distribution, and emergency assistance to anyone who needed it. This wasn't optional charity work. It was literally part of their religious vows and legal obligations. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed most European monasteries, explicitly required monks to welcome strangers, care for the sick, and provide for the poor. These weren't suggestions. They were divine commandments that had been followed for over 800 years. Refusing charity wasn't just breaking monastery rules. It was essentially spitting in God's face, which tends to be frowned upon in religious communities. But when the Black Death arrived, this sacred obligation became a perfect recipe for communal suicide. Every act of charity potentially brought death into the monastery. Every stranger they welcomed might be carrying plague. Every sick person they cared for could infect the entire community. It was like being legally required to hug everyone during a zombie apocalypse. Technically the right thing to do according to your rules, but practically guaranteed to get you killed. This created the medieval equivalent of an impossible ethical dilemma wrapped in a religious crisis with a side of practical disaster. Monks found themselves choosing between their immortal souls and their mortal lives, between their sacred vows and basic survival instincts. And unlike modern ethical dilemmas that philosophers can debate in comfortable academic settings, this one came with immediate life or death, consequences, and no clear right answers. Consider the tragic case of the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris, one of the most prestigious monasteries in France and the traditional burial place of French kings. When plague refugees started arriving at their gates in 1348, the monks faced an impossible choice: follow their sacred obligations to provide sanctuary, or protect their community by turning away desperate people who had nowhere else to go. Abbot Gilles de Pontoise made the decision that probably seemed obvious at the time: they would continue following the rule of Saint Benedict, no matter what. The abbey opened its doors, converted their guest halls into makeshift hospitals, and began caring for plague victims with the same dedication they had always shown to royal visitors and important pilgrims. They probably felt pretty good about themselves, confident that God would protect his faithful servants who were sacrificing everything to help the suffering. Within 6 weeks, 37 of the 42 monks at St. Denis were dead, including Abbot Gilles himself. The survivors found themselves in charge of a monastery that had been functioning continuously since the 7th century, suddenly responsible for maintaining one of Europe's most important religious institutions with a staff smaller than a modern McDonald's crew. Brother Pierre, one of the 5 survivors, wrote that they couldn't even ring all the bells for services because they literally didn't have enough people to operate the bell tower properly. The irony was devastating. By following their religious obligations perfectly, they had essentially destroyed their ability to continue serving God or anyone else. It was like a fire department burning down while responding to every emergency call. Technically, they did their job correctly, but the end result was that no one could do the job anymore. Another heartbreaking example comes from the monastery of Cluny, the mother house of one of medieval Europe's most powerful monastic orders. Cluny had spent centuries building a reputation for spectacular charitable works, maintaining elaborate guest facilities that could accommodate hundreds of visitors and running what was essentially medieval Europe's most comprehensive social services program. When plague refugees started arriving by the hundreds, the monks initially tried to maintain their traditional level of hospitality. They set up additional sleeping areas, organized massive communal meals, and created makeshift medical facilities in their workshops and storage rooms. Brother Hugh of Marsigny described the monastery as looking like a city under siege, but we welcomed the siege because it was our sacred duty. The problem was that concentrating hundreds of potentially infected people in close quarters was like creating a plague laboratory designed for maximum transmission efficiency. Within days, the disease was spreading not just among the refugees, but among the monks who were caring for them. Brother Hugh watched helplessly as his community transformed from a well-organized charitable institution into a chaotic death trap where the caregivers were dying faster than the people they were trying to help. The final tragedy at Cluny came when they realized they had become part of the problem, rather than part of the solution. Refugees who contracted plague at the monastery carried it to other communities, spreading the disease even further. The monks' charitable impulses had turned them into an unintentional plague distribution center, defeating the very purpose of their charitable mission. This wasn't isolated to a few unfortunate monasteries. It was a pattern repeated across medieval Europe with predictable and devastating results. Monasteries that maintained traditional charitable practices experienced mortality rates of 60 to 80%, while those that restricted access and limited outside contact had survival rates closer to 30 to 40%. The mathematics were brutal and unmistakable. Following traditional monastic charity during the Black Death was statistically equivalent to community suicide. The pattern revealed a fundamental flaw in medieval religious thinking that no one had anticipated. For centuries, monks had operated under the assumption that doing God's work provided divine protection. This wasn't just spiritual comfort. It was practical policy that had seemed to work for generations. Monasteries had survived wars, famines, and political upheavals by maintaining their charitable obligations and trusting in divine protection. The Black Death exposed this assumption as dangerously naive. Disease didn't care about religious devotion, charitable works, or divine favor. Bacteria and viruses operated according to biological laws that had nothing to do with spiritual merit. This was a devastating revelation for people whose entire worldview was built on the assumption that moral behavior produced tangible rewards and divine protection. Social and economic factors made the pattern even worse. Monasteries were often located along major travel routes to facilitate their charitable missions, putting them directly in the path of disease transmission. Their wealth and reputation attracted desperate people from wide areas, concentrating infected populations in exactly the places least equipped to handle medical emergencies. Their charitable obligations prevented them from implementing basic quarantine measures that might have saved lives. The psychological factors were equally destructive. Monks who survived by abandoning traditional charity faced crushing guilt and spiritual crisis. Those who maintained charitable practices often died with their faith intact, but their communities destroyed. There was literally no way to win. Every choice involved fundamental spiritual and practical compromises that violated core principles of monastic life. The effects were catastrophic on multiple levels that historians are still trying to fully understand. Individual monasteries that had operated successfully for centuries were either completely destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. Entire monastic orders faced extinction as their member houses fell one by one to plague accelerated. Mortality. The survivors who had abandoned traditional charity faced a crisis that went beyond simple guilt. They had to rebuild their communities while questioning everything they had previously believed about divine protection, religious obligation, and the fundamental nature of their relationship with God. Many experienced what we would now recognize as survivors' guilt combined with religious trauma. They were alive because they had violated their sacred vows, but dead because they had kept them. Local communities that had depended on monastic charity for generations suddenly found themselves without social services, medical care, or economic support. Peasants who had relied on monastery employment faced starvation. Students lost their schools. The sick lost their hospitals. Political systems that had depended on wealthy monasteries as stabilizing forces found themselves dealing with power vacuums and economic collapse. The long-term theological implications were even more profound. If following God's commandments perfectly led to death and destruction, while violating sacred vows led to survival, what did that say about divine justice? If prayer and charitable works provided no protection against disease, what was the point of religious life? These questions didn't have comfortable answers, and they would eventually contribute to major religious upheavals, including the Protestant Reformation. Economically, the destruction of charitable monasteries created social problems that lasted for centuries. The medieval social safety net had depended heavily on religious institutions that were now either gone or operating at drastically reduced capacity. Secular authorities found themselves facing social responsibilities they had never handled before, without the infrastructure or experience to manage them effectively. Yet even as monks struggled with impossible choices between charity and survival, they faced an even more fundamental crisis that cut to the heart of medieval religious belief. The people they had always guided spiritually were now looking to them for explanations of why a supposedly benevolent and all-powerful God was allowing such unprecedented suffering. And the uncomfortable truth was that the monks had absolutely no idea how to answer that question, because they were asking it themselves. The theological crisis brewing in plague devastated monasteries would soon explode into a full-scale challenge to religious authority that made their practical problems look simple by comparison. By 1349, the theological house of cards that had supported medieval Christianity for over 1,000 years was collapsing faster than a Ponzi scheme during a market crash. The Black Death had created a crisis that went far beyond simple death and disease. It had fundamentally challenged every assumption about divine justice, religious authority, and the basic nature of God's relationship with humanity. And guess who everyone was looking to for answers? That's right, the traumatized. Dying monks who were having their own spiritual crises while trying to figure out why their prayers weren't working. Medieval theology had a neat explanation for everything. Suffering was either punishment for sin, a test of faith, or an opportunity for spiritual growth. Disease was divine judgment. Death was God's will. The righteous were rewarded, the wicked were punished, and everything happened according to a divine plan that might be mysterious, but was ultimately just and benevolent. This framework had worked pretty well for centuries. mainly because nobody had faced anything quite like the Black Death. But when the plague started, killing indiscriminately, babies, saints, sinners, and monks with equal efficiency, the entire theological system started looking like an elaborate fantasy designed by people who had never faced a real crisis. Suddenly, monks found themselves in the impossible position of having to explain why God was apparently punishing everyone simultaneously, including his most faithful servants who had dedicated their lives to worship and charity. The stakes couldn't have been higher. These weren't just intellectual debates. They were questions about the fundamental nature of reality being asked by desperate people who needed answers immediately. And the monks, who had built their entire identity around having a direct connection to divine truth, were discovering that they were just as confused and terrified as everyone else. The crisis reached its breaking point at the Abbey of St. Gall in what is now Switzerland, during what chroniclers would later call the Great Disputation of 1349. Though calling it a disputation makes it sound much more civilized than it actually was. The abbey had been a center of learning for over 600 years, famous throughout Europe for its scholarship, its library, and its theological expertise. When the plague arrived, people from across the region flocked to St. Gall expecting answers, guidance, and spiritual comfort from some of the most learned monks in Christendom. What they found instead was a community in complete theological meltdown. Abbot Rudolf of Habsburg, who had been considered one of the greatest theological minds of his generation, was publicly questioning whether God existed at all. Brother Marcus, the abbey's most respected biblical scholar, was arguing that the plague proved Christianity was false and that they should convert to Judaism because Jewish communities seemed to be suffering less. Another monk, Brother Wilhelm, had apparently decided that the plague was actually a good thing because it was speeding up the apocalypse and the second coming of Christ. The situation exploded during what was supposed to be a simple evening service. A group of desperate villagers had come to the abbey seeking spiritual comfort after losing their children to plague. They asked Abbot Rudolf the kind of question that monks had been answering for centuries. Why is God allowing this to happen? To innocent children? Instead of providing the traditional theological response about divine mystery and the greater good, Abbot Rudolf apparently snapped. According to Brother Francis, who witnessed the event, the abbot stood up in front of the assembled crowd and declared, "I have spent 40 years studying theology, and I can tell you with complete certainty, but I have absolutely no idea what God is doing, if he exists at all, or why we ever thought we understood his will." The crowd's reaction was immediate and devastating. People who had traveled for days seeking spiritual comfort were told by God's representative that he didn't actually know anything about God. Some began weeping. Others started shouting accusations at the monks. A few apparently tried to attack the altar, either to destroy it or to pray more desperately. The chronicles aren't clear which. Brother Marcus made things worse by jumping up and declaring that the abbot was right, that Christianity was obviously false, and that they should all convert to Judaism immediately, because at least the Jews are honest about not understanding God's will. This triggered Brother Wilhelm to start screaming about the end times and how they should be celebrating because the plague was bringing about the kingdom of heaven. The entire service dissolved into chaos. Monks were arguing with each other about fundamental questions of faith, while desperate lay people watched their spiritual leaders have complete nervous breakdowns. Some villagers fled the abbey. Others stayed to argue with the monks. A few apparently tried to organize their own prayer service, since the official one had imploded. The climax came when someone, the chronicles don't agree on who, asked the ultimate question. If you don't know why God is doing this, and you don't know how to stop it, and you don't even know if God exists, then what's the point of any of this? The question hung in the air like a theological bomb that had just detonated. According to Brother Francis, the silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard, because it was the sound of faith dying in real time. The response to the St. Gall incident was swift and revealed just how widespread the theological crisis had become. Within weeks, reports of similar incidents started coming in from monasteries across Europe. Monks were having public breakdowns, abandoning their vows, questioning fundamental doctrines, and in some cases, converting to other religions or declaring themselves atheists, which was barely even a concept in medieval Europe. The church hierarchy tried to control the damage through a combination of damage control, censorship, and what would now be called gaslighting. Bishops issued statements declaring that any monk who questioned divine providence was obviously suffering from plague-induced madness and should be ignored. Abbot Rudolf was quietly removed from his position and sent to a remote monastery for spiritual rehabilitation, which was medieval speak for house arrest until he stopped embarrassing the church. But the damage was done. Word of the St. Gall incident spread faster than the plague itself, carried by the same traveling merchants, refugees, and pilgrims who were spreading the disease. Suddenly, lay people across Europe were asking their local monks the same uncomfortable questions that had triggered the crisis at St. Gall. And most of those monks were just as confused and unprepared as Abbot Rudolf had been. The immediate consequences were catastrophic for church authority. Attendance at religious services plummeted as people decided that if the monks didn't know what they were doing, there was no point in listening to them. The donations to monasteries dropped off dramatically. Some communities actually expelled their monks, deciding that fraudulent spiritual guides were worse than no spiritual guides at all. Political ramifications followed quickly. Secular authorities who had always deferred to religious authorities on moral and social questions suddenly found themselves dealing with a power vacuum. If the church couldn't explain God's will, then maybe secular rulers didn't need to follow church guidance on governance, taxation, or social policy. This would eventually contribute to the rise of secular authority and the decline of medieval theocracy. Individual monks faced personal crises that often lasted for years. Those who had built their entire identity around religious certainty found themselves adrift in a world where nothing made sense. Some left monastic life entirely. Others retreated into more extreme forms of religious observance, hoping that if they just prayed harder or followed the rules more carefully, God would start making sense again. The St. Gall incident wasn't just a localized breakdown. It was a symptom of a civilization-wide crisis that would reshape European culture for centuries. The Black Death had exposed the fundamental fragility of medieval religious certainty, revealing that even the most learned and devout religious authorities were just humans trying to make sense of an incomprehensible world. This crisis of authority would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation, the rise of scientific thinking, and the development of secular philosophy. When people stopped believing that religious authorities had special access to divine truth, they started looking for other sources of knowledge and guidance. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and eventually the modern world all have roots in the theological crisis triggered by the Black Death. The incident also revealed the psychological impossibility of maintaining religious certainty in the face of genuine catastrophe. Medieval theology worked fine when life was merely difficult, but it completely collapsed when confronted with genuine existential horror. This would force later religious thinkers to develop more sophisticated approaches to the problem of evil and suffering. Most importantly, the St. Gall crisis demonstrated that religious authority is ultimately dependent on perceived competence and credibility. When monks could no longer provide satisfactory answers to fundamental questions, people stopped treating them as authorities. This lesson would be repeated throughout history whenever religious institutions failed to adapt to changing circumstances or to acknowledged the limits of their knowledge. The great theological meltdown of 1349 marked the beginning of the end for medieval religious certainty. What had started as a medical crisis had become an existential crisis that would echo through European history for centuries. And for the monks who survived this catastrophe, the worst was yet to come, because now they had to figure out how to rebuild their faith, their communities, and their credibility while the world watched and waited to see if they had learned anything from their spectacular failure to understand God's plan. When the Black Death first hit European monasteries, the immediate response wasn't panic or practical planning. It was a continent-wide shopping spree for holy relics that would make Black Friday crowds look civilized. Monasteries across Europe suddenly decided that their salvation depended on acquiring the most powerful spiritual artifacts available, leading to what historians now call the medieval equivalent of a run on the spiritual bank. Brother Albertus of Regensburg documented what might be the most absurd example of this relic mania. His monastery, convinced that they needed better divine protection, decided to purchase a fragment of the true cross from a traveling merchant who claimed to have obtained it directly from Jerusalem. The asking price was roughly equivalent to the monastery's entire annual income, but the monks were so desperate that they actually considered selling their land to afford it. The comedy began when 3 other monasteries in the region made similar purchases from the same merchant, each receiving authentic fragments of the true cross that were supposedly from different parts of the original. Brother Albertus, who had some basic mathematical skills, calculated that if all the authentic fragments being sold across Europe were actually from the true cross, the original cross would have been roughly the size of a small forest. But real hilarity started when the monasteries compared their purchases and discovered that not only were they identical pieces of ordinary wood, but they all came with the same handwritten certificate of authenticity, which was in Latin so poor that it essentially said, "This wood is very holy and costs much money. Please pay now. Thank you. God bless." The merchant, who called himself Brother Francis of the Holy Land, but spoke with what was obviously a local German accent, had apparently been traveling from monastery to monastery selling the same fake relics to increasingly desperate religious communities. His business model was brilliant in its simplicity. Take advantage of panic-stricken monks who were too afraid to question the authenticity of anything that promised divine protection. The 4 monasteries that had been scammed ended up forming what they called a spiritual alliance to track down the fraudulent relic merchant, which basically involved sending monks on a medieval wild goose chase across Central Europe. Brother Albertus described their quest as the most expensive theological education we never wanted, as they discovered that approximately half the holy relics in circulation were obvious fakes made by enterprising craftsmen who had realized that desperate monks weren't asking too many questions about provenance. The story gets better. When they finally caught up with Brother Francis, they discovered he wasn't even a monk. He was a former carpenter named Klaus who had figured out that carving religious symbols into random pieces of wood and claiming they were miraculous was considerably more profitable than making actual furniture. Klaus had been so successful that he had hired assistants and was running what amounted to a medieval relic factory. The confrontation between 4 monasteries worth of angry monks and one very nervous fake relic salesman apparently lasted 3 days and involved theological debates, threats of excommunication, and at least one attempt at an impromptu trial by ordeal. Klaus eventually agreed to refund their money, but only if they promised not to tell other monasteries about his business model, because he still had outstanding orders from communities in France and Italy. The final twist came when the monks realized that even though their relics were fake, several miraculous healings had occurred among people who had prayed near them. This created a theological crisis within their theological crisis. If fake relics produced real miracles, what did that say about the nature of divine intervention? Brother Albertus solved this dilemma with impeccable medieval logic by declaring that God had chosen to work through false relics to teach them about the importance of faith over material objects, which was either profound theological insight or impressive mental gymnastics. The practice of consolidating plague devastated monasteries led to some of the most entertaining administrative disasters in medieval history. None more spectacular than what happened when the remnants of 3 different monastic communities tried to merge into a single functional institution at the former Abbey of St. Gervais in northern France. The problem began with the basic issue that each monastery followed different versions of monastic rules that had evolved over centuries to suit their specific communities and circumstances. The Benedictines from St. Gervais were used to a relatively relaxed schedule with substantial time for individual study and contemplation. The Cistercians from nearby Quito were accustomed to more rigorous physical labor and stricter dietary restrictions. The Franciscans from a dissolved community near Paris had embraced extreme poverty and spent most of their time serving the poor in urban areas. Brother Matthias, who served as the unofficial chronicler of this merger disaster, described the first week as attempting to teach wolves, sheep, and chickens to live together harmoniously while following the same daily schedule. The Benedictines wanted to continue their traditional leisurely pace of 7 prayer services per day, with substantial breaks for reading and copying manuscripts. The Cistercians insisted on maintaining their 5 daily services combined with extensive manual labor in the fields. The Franciscans argued for a completely flexible schedule that prioritized responding to community needs over fixed prayer times. The dying situation became particularly absurd. Benedictine tradition allowed for me on certain days and relatively comfortable meals with conversation during designated times. Cistercian rules required vegetarian meals eaten in complete silence while listening to religious readings. Franciscan practice involved eating whatever was available and sharing it with any poor people who happened to be around, which often meant feeding significantly more people than the kitchen had planned for. Brother Matthias documented one memorable dinner where the Benedictines were trying to have a civilized conversation about theological matters while the Cistercians sat in rigid silence, listening to a reading from the lives of saints, and the Franciscans kept bringing in homeless travelers to share the meal. The situation deteriorated when the Cistercians objected to the presence of unwashed strangers at their purification-focused dining experience. The Benedictines complained that they couldn't hear their theological discussion over the saints' life being read aloud, and the Franciscans accused both groups of caring more about dining etiquette than Christian charity. The sleeping arrangements created even more problems. Benedictines traditionally had individual cells that provided privacy for personal prayer and study. Cistercians slept in common dormitories that fostered community solidarity and simplified heating during winter months. Franciscans were accustomed to sleeping wherever was convenient, often giving up their beds to travelers who needed shelter. The attempted compromise solution was to create a schedule that rotated between different traditions on different days of the week, which meant that Monday was Benedictine Day, Tuesday was Cistercian Day, Wednesday was Franciscan Day, and so on. This created a surreal situation where the entire monastery changed its fundamental operating procedures every 24 hours, like some kind of medieval theme restaurant. Brother Matthias described the Thursday transition from Cistercian to Franciscan Day as particularly chaotic. At dawn, we were rising for silent prayer and manual labor in the fields. By noon, we were welcoming travelers and organizing impromptu charitable expeditions to nearby villages. And by evening, we were wondering why anyone thought this schedule would work for more than a week. The breaking point came during what Brother Matthias called the the Great Bell Catastrophe of 1349. Each monastic tradition had different bell signals for different activities, but they were trying to use the same bell tower to coordinate 3 different daily schedules. The result was the bells were ringing almost constantly as different groups tried to call their members to different activities, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles and attracted complaints from neighboring villages who thought the monastery was either under attack or celebrating some extremely elaborate religious festival. The final straw came when a group of Cistercians, exhausted from trying to maintain silent contemplation while surrounded by Franciscan community, service projects, and Benedictine scholarly discussions, attempted to establish a quiet zone in the eastern wing of the monastery. This led to territorial disputes, accusations of spiritual elitism, and at least one documented case of monks literally drawing lines on the floor to mark which areas belonged to which groups. The merger was officially dissolved after 6 weeks, when the remaining monks agreed that trying to maintain 3 different monastic traditions simultaneously was more stressful than the plague had been. They split up the monastery's resources and went their separate ways, with Brother Matthias noting that we learned that unity in crisis does not necessarily mean uniformity in practice, and that some problems are actually easier to solve by avoiding them entirely. Medieval monks' attempts to combat plague through herbal remedies led to some of the most entertainingly disastrous medical experiments in European history. With no understanding of disease transmission, bacterial infection, or basic pharmacology, monastic infirmaries became medieval laboratories where well-meaning monks tried increasingly desperate and ridiculous treatments based on theological reasoning, ancient texts, and occasionally just wild guessing. Brother Hildegard of Passau, not the famous mystic, another Hildegard, because medieval maiming was as creative as modern sequel titles, documented what might be the most comprehensive collection of failed plague remedies in medieval literature. Hildegard was the monastery's herbalist, a position that sounds impressive until you realize it meant the monk who was slightly better than everyone else in identifying which plants probably wouldn't kill you immediately. Hildegard's first approach was based on the medieval theory that diseases were caused by corruption of the air, which meant that the solution was obviously to purify the atmosphere using pleasant-smelling herbs. This led to the Great Aromatic Experiment of 1348, where the entire monastery was filled with burning herbs, incense, and flowers to create an environment so pure that disease couldn't survive. The experiment started promisingly, with the monastery smelling like the world's most elaborate medieval potpourri shop. However, Hildegard had miscalculated the ventilation requirements for burning large quantities of organic matter in enclosed spaces. Within 2 days, the monastery was so filled with smoke that the monks couldn't see across rooms. Everyone was coughing constantly, and several brothers had developed what appeared to be respiratory infections from inhaling too much herbal smoke. Brother Anselm, who served as Hildegard's reluctant assistant, described the scene. We attempted to cure plague by creating an atmosphere so pure that evil humors could not survive, but instead created an atmosphere so thick that humans could barely survive. Brother Marcus was found yesterday wandering the halls with tears streaming down his face, not from spiritual ecstasy, but from frankincense overdose. Undeterred by this failure, Hildegard moved on to internal herbal treatments based on the theory that consuming enough purifying herbs would make a person's blood too pure for plague to contaminate. This led to increasingly elaborate herbal concoctions that were essentially medieval smoothies made from every plant that ancient texts had ever described as having healing properties. The recipe started, reasonably enough, with common herbs like rosemary and thyme, but gradually escalated to include more exotic ingredients as Hildegard became convinced that more unusual plants must have more powerful healing properties. Brother Anselm documented one memorable recipe that included 3 parts wormwood, 2 parts mandrake root, 1 part ground unicorn horn or rhinoceros horn, if unicorn unavailable, 7 blessed rose petals, and enough wine to make the mixture palatable to Christians. The unicorn horn was actually narwhal tusk that had been purchased from a merchant, who claimed it had come from a unicorn killed by a virgin in the forests of Germany. The cost was astronomical, but the monks were desperate. Enough to trade their best illuminated manuscripts for what they believed was a magical healing ingredient. The irony was that narwhal tusk actually has no medicinal properties whatsoever, but it was expensive enough that everyone assumed it must be powerful. The results of these herbal experiments were predictably disastrous. Brother Anselm described the effects. The brothers who consumed Hildegard's healing mixtures experienced visions, but not the holy kind. Brother Thomas spent 3 days convinced that he could speak with animals, though the animals did not appear to be responding. Brother Wilhelm claimed to see angels, but they were telling him to stop drinking Hildegard's potions. The situation reached peak absurdity when Hildegard decided that if small amounts of herbal medicine were good, massive amounts must be better. This led to what Brother Anselm called the week of botanical overdoses, during which half the surviving monks were essentially hallucinating from consuming excessive quantities of medicinal herbs, while trying to treat a disease that they didn't understand, using plants that had no relevant therapeutic properties. The final herbal disaster came when Hildegard attempted to create a universal healing potion by combining every beneficial herb mentioned in all the medical texts the monastery possessed. The resulting mixture was described by Brother Anselm as resembling swamp water in appearance and tasting like punishment for unnamed sins. 3 monks who consumed it experienced what were diplomatically described as digestive disturbances, so severe that they were confined to the latrines for 2 days. The experiment ended when Brother Anselm pointed out that they had spent more money on failed herbal remedies than the monastery's entire annual budget for food, and that the monks who had avoided Hildegard's treatments entirely were actually healthier than those who had participated in the experiments. Hildegard reluctantly admitted that perhaps their approach needed refinement, though she continued to insist that the theoretical foundation was sound even if the practical application needed work done as the plague worsened and traditional religious explanations failed to provide comfort or solutions. Many monks began claiming to receive direct divine messages through dreams, visions, and supernatural experiences. This led to what Brother Gregory of Tours described as the most theologically chaotic period in our monastery's 300-year history, as competing prophetic revelations created a situation where God apparently had contradictory opinions about everything, from prayer schedules to agricultural policy. The chaos began when Brother Sebastian, who had always been considered one of the more mystically inclined monks, announced that he had received a vision during prayer instructing the community to change their daily schedule to counteract the plague. According to Sebastian's divine revelation, God had revealed that the Black Death was caused by the community praying at the wrong times, and that shifting their prayer schedule by 2 hours would restore divine protection. This might have been manageable if Sebastian had been the only monk receiving supernatural guidance. Unfortunately, his announcement apparently inspired other community members to pay closer attention to their own dreams and meditation experiences, leading to a cascade of competing prophetic claims that turned the monastery into a medieval free-for-all of divine revelation. Brother Augustine, not the famous saint, another Augustine, claimed that his prayers had been answered with a vision instructing the community to fast completely on Wednesdays and Fridays to demonstrate their spiritual purity. Brother Francis, not the famous saint either, seriously, medieval naming conventions reported a dream where an angel told him that the plague would end only if the monastery gave away all their worldly possessions and embraced complete poverty. Brother Thomas, at this point, you can assume that none of these are famous saints, had a revelation that God wanted them to build a special chapel oriented toward Jerusalem and pray facing east at all times. Brother Gregory documented the escalating theological confusion. We now have 4 different divine commandments about prayer times, 3 conflicting instructions about fasting, 2 contradictory revelations about property ownership, and 1 very specific architectural requirement that would cost more money than we possess. Either God is testing our discernment, or several of our brothers are experiencing religiously themed hallucinations. The situation became even more complex when some monks began claiming that their visions specifically contradicted other monks' visions, leading to heated theological debates about the relative authenticity of different supernatural experiences. Brother Sebastian argued that his vision was more reliable because it had occurred during formal prayer time in the chapel, while Brother Augustine insisted that his dream was more trustworthy because it had been accompanied by a feeling of overwhelming peace and a pleasant fragrance that he interpreted as divine perfume. Brother Gregory, who was trying to maintain some semblance of administrative order during this outbreak of competing mysticism, attempted to establish criteria for evaluating the authenticity of divine revelations. His list included theological consistency, practical feasibility, and agreement with established church doctrine, which immediately disqualified most of the visions. The monks were reporting that the breaking point came when Brother Marcus announced that he had received a vision instructing the community to ignore all previous visions because they were demonic deceptions, designed to distract the monks from their true spiritual calling. This created a theological paradox. If Brother Marcus's vision was authentic, then all previous visions were false. But if previous visions were false, how could anyone trust Brother Marcus's vision about their falseness? Brother Gregory described the resulting philosophical chaos. We have reached the point where questioning divine revelations has itself become a divine revelation, which calls into question the validity of questioning divine revelations, which suggests that we may have created a theological infinite loop that could continue until the end of time. The crisis was finally resolved when Brother Abbot William, who had been quietly watching this supernatural circus unfold, announced that he had received his own divine vision, instructing everyone to stop having visions immediately and return to following established monastic rules until God decided to provide clearer guidance through official church channels. The fact that this announcement ended the outbreak of competing mystical experiences suggested that either God had finally provided definitive guidance, or that the monks had exhausted their capacity for creative theological interpretation. Brother Gregory's final observation was that the experience taught us that divine revelation is considerably easier to claim than to verify, and that God's will apparently becomes much clearer when filtered through established religious authority rather than individual interpretation. We have decided to resume following traditional practices while remaining open to genuine divine guidance. Should it ever arrive through channels that don't contradict each other or require us to violate the laws of physics. The aftermath of the prophetic dreams fiasco became a cautionary tale that was shared among monasteries throughout Europe, serving as a reminder that spiritual desperation during crisis conditions could lead to theological chaos if not carefully managed through established religious structures and community discernment processes. Around the major theological meltdowns and mass deaths, other fascinating characters played crucial roles in this medieval disaster movie, each representing different aspects of how people cope when their entire world falls apart. These weren't the famous abbots or renowned scholars making headlines. They were the supporting cast whose stories revealed just how weird, desperate, and occasionally hilarious human behavior becomes during civilizational collapse. Brother Edmund, the chronicler from Bury St. Edmunds, was the medieval equivalent of a war correspondent, except his war was against an invisible enemy and his battlefield was everywhere. Edmund had originally been assigned to maintain the monastery's records, births, deaths, land transactions, the occasional miracle. Basically medieval bookkeeping with better job security. But when the plague hit, he became obsessed with documenting every detail of the catastrophe with the dedication of someone live tweeting the apocalypse. Edmund's chronicles reveal a man slowly losing his mind while trying to maintain professional objectivity about the end of his world. His entries start out formal and composed. On this day, Brother Marcus departed this life. May God rest his soul. But by month 6, he's writing things like, "Today we buried 3 more brothers. I no longer remember their names. I no longer remember my own prayers. The rats in the walls sound like they're laughing at us." Edmund's transformation from professional chronicler to traumatized survivor provides a real-time record of psychological breakdown that reads like a medieval horror novel. Brother Aldrich the beekeeper represented the practical side of monastic collapse. While everyone else was having theological crises, Aldrich was dealing with the fact that bees don't care about plague, theology, or human suffering. They just want their hives maintained. As his community died around him, Aldrich found himself responsible for producing honey, not just for his own monastery, but for the 3 neighboring communities whose beekeepers had died. He became a sort of medieval essential worker, traveling between plague-devastated monasteries to maintain apiaries while dodging both disease and bandits. Aldrich's letters to his sister reveal a man who found sanity in routine maintenance while everything else collapsed. "Sister Margaret," he wrote, "while learned men debate whether God exists, the bees continue to make honey. This seems significant, though I cannot say why." Aldrich survived the plague, outlived most of his community, and spent his final years as possibly the only monk in England whose primary qualification was insect management rather than theological training. Father Bernard the treasurer faced perhaps the most absurd challenge of all, managing monastery finances during economic collapse, while maintaining moral principles about usury and charity. Medieval monasteries were major economic players, but their financial systems were built on assumptions about stable populations, predictable agricultural output, and continuous charitable obligations. When half your workforce dies and your primary income sources disappear overnight, even divinely inspired budgeting becomes problematic. Bernard's account books from this period read like a masterclass in crisis management combined with religious comedy. He documented elaborate schemes to maintain charitable giving while facing bankruptcy, including one plan to pay debts using promises of prayers rather than actual money, essentially trying to run a monastery on spiritual credit. When local merchants rejected this innovative payment method, Bernard apparently tried to convince them that accepting prayers instead of gold was good for their souls, which went about as well as you'd expect. These weren't isolated incidents of individual weirdness. They were part of complex networks of relationships and dependencies that made the plague's effects cascade through medieval society like a particularly destructive game of dominoes. The stories interweave in ways that reveal how completely interconnected medieval life was, and how the failure of one institution could trigger failures throughout entire regions. Edmund the Chronicler's detailed records weren't just personal therapy. They became crucial legal documents when surviving monasteries needed to prove property ownership after their communities had been decimated. His obsessive documentation of deaths, land transfers, and community decisions provided the only reliable records for settling inheritance disputes, property claims, and monastic mergers that became necessary when multiple communities had to combine their surviving members. This created a weird situation where Edmund's psychological breakdown documentation became some of the most valuable legal documents in medieval England. Lawyers were literally using the diary entries of a traumatized monk to settle major property disputes, which seems appropriate given how surreal the entire period had become. Aldrich the beekeeper's travels between monasteries made him an unofficial communications network at a time when normal messenger services had collapsed. His honey delivery routes became informal postal services, carrying letters between isolated communities and serving as a source of news about which monasteries were still functioning. Political alliances and economic partnerships were maintained. Through conversations with a beekeeper who just wanted to keep his insects alive, the interdependencies became almost comically complex. Bernard the Treasurer's financial innovations were being copied by other monasteries facing similar crises, creating a network of experimental economic policies that bypassed traditional banking systems. Monasteries were essentially creating their own alternative economy based on bartering prayers, promising future harvests and trading skilled labor between communities. When Aldrich delivered honey to monasteries, he often carried Bernard's letters about financial arrangements to other treasurers. Edmund documented these arrangements in his chronicles, which then became legal precedents for other communities. A beekeeper, a traumatized record keeper, and a financially creative treasurer had accidentally created an informal system for maintaining monastic civilization during civilizational collapse. The political networks were equally intertwined. Local nobles who had traditionally donated to specific monasteries found themselves dealing with community mergers, property redistributions, and completely new leadership structures. Some adapted by spreading their charitable giving across multiple surviving communities. Others tried to consolidate power by taking control of weakened monasteries. Directly to understand why these stories matter, you have to understand how completely medieval daily life revolved around monastic institutions. Monasteries weren't just religious centers. They were economic engines, educational institutions, medical facilities, entertainment venues, and social safety nets all rolled into one. When they started failing, it wasn't just a religious crisis. It was like having hospitals, schools, banks, farms, and government offices all shut down simultaneously. Medieval people's daily routines were structured around monastic schedules. Church bells marked time for entire communities. Monastic feast days determined work schedules and social gatherings. The agricultural calendar followed religious observances. When monasteries couldn't maintain their normal schedules because half their monks were dead, ordinary people lost their basic framework for organizing daily life. The social hierarchies were equally dependent on monastic stability. Abbots were major political players who mediated disputes, arranged marriages, and managed economic relationships between different social classes. When abbots died faster than they could be replaced, local power structures collapsed into chaos. Peasants didn't know who to pay rent to. Merchants didn't know who had authority to make trade agreements. Local nobles found themselves dealing with power vacuums that no one was prepared to fill. Cultural activities that had seemed permanent suddenly disappeared. Monastic schools closed, leaving entire generations without formal education. Scriptoriums stopped producing books, interrupting the preservation of knowledge that had continued for centuries. Charitable festivals and religious celebrations were canceled because there weren't enough monks to organize them. The psychological impact was devastating in ways that are hard for modern people to understand. Medieval life was built around assumptions of permanence and divine order that the plague shattered completely. People who had never questioned the stability of their social institutions suddenly found themselves living in a world where nothing could be counted on to continue existing. Perhaps most ironically, many of the monks who survived the plague did so precisely because they were bad at being traditional monks. Aldrich the beekeeper survived because he spent most of his time outside the monastery, away from infected communities. Bernard the treasurer survived because his financial duties required him to travel frequently, limiting his exposure to plague-infected monastery populations. Meanwhile, the most devout and traditionally observant monks Those who maintained strict cloistered lifestyles, followed charitable obligations religiously, and spent the most time in communal activities, had the highest mortality rates. The plague essentially selected for monks who were already breaking traditional monastic rules about isolation from the world and strict community life. This created a massive contradiction that survivors had to grapple with. The monks who lived were those who had been least faithful to traditional monastic ideals, while the most devoted monks had died in droves. If survival was any indication of divine favor, then God apparently preferred monks who focused on practical concerns rather than spiritual devotion. The economic contradictions were equally absurd. Monasteries that had preached about the spiritual dangers of wealth often became incredibly rich because they inherited property from plague victims. Communities that had emphasized poverty and simplicity suddenly found themselves managing vast estates with no moral framework for handling unexpected prosperity. Some surviving monks became wealthy almost by accident, inheriting everything from deceased benefactors who had left their property to monasteries. Others faced complete destitution because their traditional sources of income had disappeared. The plague had randomly redistributed wealth in ways that had nothing to do with spiritual merit, practical competence, or moral worth. Another blow to medieval assumptions about divine justice and cosmic order. Everything changed when the surviving monks finally realized that waiting for things to return to normal was like waiting for unicorns to solve their agricultural problems. Theoretically possible, but probably not a sound long-term strategy. By 1351, it had become clear that the Black Death wasn't just a temporary crisis that would pass like a bad harvest or a political upheaval. This was the new normal, and medieval monasticism would either adapt or become extinct faster than passenger pigeons. The turning point came when Brother William of Ockham, not the famous philosopher, another William, because medieval naming conventions had all the creativity of a modern chain restaurant, made a radical proposal at what remained of Westminster Abbey. Instead of trying to maintain traditional monastic practices with skeleton crews, he suggested they completely redesign monasticism for post-plague reality. This was like proposing to rebuild McDonald's as a fine dining establishment. Technically possible, but requiring fundamental changes to everything people thought they knew about the business. William's proposal was revolutionary for its time. Abandon the elaborate daily schedule of prayers that required large communities. Simplified charitable obligations to what small groups could actually handle, and focus on practical survival rather than traditional spiritual practices. Essentially, he was advocating for medieval monasticism 2.0, now with 60% fewer monks and 100% more pragmatism. The radical nature of this proposal cannot be overstated. For over 800 years, the structure of monastic life had remained essentially unchanged. The 8 daily prayer services, the complex charitable obligations, the elaborate hierarchies. These weren't just traditions. They were considered divinely ordained requirements that couldn't be modified without risking eternal damnation. William was essentially suggesting they rewrite the instruction manual for serving God, which was considerably more controversial than modern software updates. What made William's proposal even more shocking was that it was based on practical experience rather than theological theory. He had spent 2 years trying to maintain traditional practices with a community that had shrunk from 45 monks to 7, and he could demonstrate mathematically that it was impossible. When you need 8 monks to properly perform a single prayer service and you only have 7 monks total, even basic arithmetic becomes theological heresy. The transformation didn't happen overnight, partly because getting medieval monks to change anything quickly was like trying to teach cats to perform synchronized swimming. Theoretically possible, but requiring more patience than most people possessed. Resistance came from multiple directions, each with their own compelling reasons for opposing change. The theological conservatives argued that modifying traditional practices was essentially admitting that previous generations of monks had been wrong about God's requirements, which would undermine the entire foundation of religious authority. If the rule of Saint Benedict could be changed for practical reasons, what else might be wrong? This was the medieval equivalent of admitting that your company's founding principles were fundamentally flawed, not great for institutional confidence. Surviving. Elder monks, who had spent decades mastering the complex traditional practices, found themselves facing the prospect that their expertise was suddenly obsolete. Brother Anselm of Canterbury, who had memorized the entire liturgical calendar and could perform the most elaborate ceremonial functions, discovered that his skills were about as useful as being an expert in operating rotary phones during the smartphone era. The younger monks, meanwhile, were often more willing to embrace change, but lacked the authority to implement it. Brother Thomas of Aquinas, yet another Thomas, seriously, medieval parents advocated for even more radical reforms, including abandoning celibacy requirements and allowing monks to marry, so they could rebuild populations through natural reproduction, rather than recruitment. This suggestion went over about, as well as proposing to serve hamburgers at a vegetarian convention. External pressure came from secular authorities and surviving laypeople who had their own opinions about how monasteries should operate. Local nobles wanted monasteries to focus on economic productivity rather than spiritual practices, since stable agricultural output was more useful than elaborate prayers during a social crisis. Peasant communities needed practical services like medical care and education rather than complex theological debates. The breakthrough came when several monasteries began experimenting with hybrid approaches that combined traditional elements with practical modifications. The Abbey of Cluny, one of the most prestigious monastic institutions in Europe, created a simplified daily schedule that maintained the spiritual essence of traditional practices while requiring only half the personnel. Instead of 8 prayer services, they established 4 longer sessions that covered the same spiritual ground with fewer logistical requirements. Other communities began specializing in specific functions rather than trying to maintain comprehensive services. Some monasteries focused entirely on education, others on medical care, and still others on agricultural production. This specialization was revolutionary. Instead of every monastery trying to do everything, they were creating networks of institutions with complementary functions. The most successful adaptations combined practical efficiency with psychological comfort. Monks needed to feel that they were still serving God authentically, even if they were doing it differently than their predecessors. Communities that managed to frame their changes as returning to the original simplicity of early Christianity, rather than abandoning tradition, had much better success rates than those that presented change as a break with the past. The new monasticism that emerged was leaner, more flexible, and arguably more practical than its predecessor, though it came with trade-offs that took generations to fully understand. Communities that had once housed 50 to 100 monks now operated efficiently with 15 to 20 members. The elaborate hierarchies were flattened into simpler organizational structures that could function without multiple layers of administration. Daily schedules became more flexible and task-oriented rather than rigidly structured around prayer times. Monks still prayed regularly, but they adapted their spiritual practices around practical necessities like agricultural seasons, educational needs, and medical emergencies. This was a fundamental shift from a system where practical work was scheduled around spiritual obligations to one where spiritual practices were integrated with practical necessities. The relationship between monasteries and secular communities also changed dramatically. Instead of operating as semi-independent institutions that provided charity from a position of relative isolation, Monasteries became much more integrated with local economies and social structures. Monks were more likely to work directly with peasant communities, participate in local markets, and engage in political activities that would have been unthinkable for traditional monks. Charitable obligations were restructured around sustainable capacity rather than idealistic goals. Instead of trying to help everyone who asked for assistance, monasteries developed more systematic approaches to charity that prioritized long-term community stability over individual emergency response. This was more effective but less emotionally satisfying, helping fewer people more effectively rather than trying to help everyone inadequately. The intellectual culture of monasticism shifted toward practical knowledge and technical skills, rather than purely theological scholarship. Monasteries began focusing on agricultural innovation, medical training, and educational methods rather than abstract theological debates. This wasn't anti-intellectual, but it represented a fundamental reorientation toward applied knowledge, rather than theoretical speculation. Economic relationships became more complex and sophisticated. Monasteries developed new financial instruments, experimental agricultural techniques, and innovative labor arrangements that would have scandalized traditional monks but proved essential for survival in post-plague Europe. Some communities became pioneer capitalists by necessity, engaging in proto-industrial activities and commercial ventures that contradicted traditional monastic values about poverty and simplicity. Was this transformation positive or negative? The answer depends entirely on what you value and what you think monasticism was supposed to accomplish in the first place. From a practical survival perspective, the changes were unquestionably successful. They allowed monastic communities to continue existing when traditional approaches would have led to complete extinction. From a spiritual perspective, the evaluation becomes more complicated. Traditional monks had operated under the assumption that following established practices precisely was essential for salvation and spiritual development. The new monasticism suggested that practical adaptation might be more important than traditional observance, which raised fundamental questions about the nature of religious obligation and divine requirements. The immediate benefits were obvious. Monasteries that adapted survived, while those that didn't became extinct. Communities that embraced change were able to continue providing essential services to their regions, while those that maintained traditional practices often collapsed entirely. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Flexible monasticism worked better than rigid monasticism during crisis conditions. However, the long-term spiritual and cultural costs were substantial. The simplified monasticism that emerged was arguably less sophisticated intellectually, less ambitious spiritually, and less inspiring aesthetically than its predecessor. The elaborate liturgical traditions, complex theological scholarship, and magnificent artistic achievements of traditional monasticism were largely casualties of practical adaptation. The social evaluation was equally mixed. Post-plague monasticism was more responsive to practical community needs, but less capable of maintaining the cultural and intellectual functions that had made medieval monasteries centers of learning and artistic achievement. Local communities gained more practical support, but lost access to the broader cultural and intellectual resources that traditional monasteries had provided. Contemporary observers were divided in their assessments. Some praised the new monasticism for its practical effectiveness and adaptability. Others mourned the loss of traditional spiritual practices and worried that the changes represented a fundamental degradation of religious life. The debates that began during the adaptation period would continue for centuries, influencing everything from the Protestant Reformation to modern discussions about institutional change and religious authority. In the decades following the Great Monastic Adaptation, medieval Europe discovered that solving immediate survival problems often creates Entirely new problems that nobody anticipated, like fixing a leaky roof only to discover that your foundation is collapsing. The streamlined monasticism that had emerged from plague necessity worked well for basic survival, but it generated second and third order effects that transformed European society in ways that would have seemed impossible before the Black Death. The most immediate development was what historians now call monastic consolidation, a fancy term for the medieval equivalent of corporate mergers, except instead of combining companies, they were combining the remnants of religious communities that had been decimated by plague. Small monasteries that couldn't sustain independent operations merged with larger survivors, creating new hybrid institutions that bore little resemblance to their traditional predecessors. These merged communities faced identity crises that would have challenged modern corporate consultants. Imagine trying to combine Google with a small family bakery. Technically possible, but requiring fundamental decisions about corporate culture, operational priorities, and basic institutional identity. Monks from different traditions with different rules, different spiritual practices, and different ideas about everything from dietary restrictions to prayer schedules suddenly found themselves trying to create unified communities from the wreckage of their previous lives. The economic ramifications were staggering and largely unintended. Monasteries that had simplified their operations and focused on practical efficiency often became more profitable than their traditional predecessors had ever been. Without elaborate ceremonial obligations and massive charitable commitments, streamlined monastic communities could invest more resources in productive activities like agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. Some monasteries accidentally became major economic powers. The Abbey of St. Denis, rebuilt after its plague devastation, focused on wine production and became one of the largest commercial enterprises in medieval France. Their success wasn't due to superior business planning. They just had fewer monks to feed, fewer ceremonies to fund, and more practical focus on activities that generated income rather than spiritual merit. This economic success created new moral dilemmas that traditional monastic theology hadn't anticipated. When monks who had taken vows of poverty found themselves managing profitable enterprises that were making them wealthy by medieval standards, they faced questions about whether prosperity was compatible with spiritual devotion. Some communities embraced their success as evidence of divine favor. Others worried that they were abandoning their spiritual mission for material gain. The transformation of monasticism created opportunities for entirely new types of religious figures who would have had no place in traditional medieval Christianity. These weren't reformers working within established systems. They were pioneers, creating new approaches to religious life that traditional monks would have considered bizarre or heretical. Brother Francis of Assisi, not the famous saint, yet another Francis, represented a new type of monk who combined traditional spiritual dedication with entrepreneurial innovation. Francis had survived the plague at a small Franciscan community by developing innovative agricultural techniques that dramatically increased crop yields. His success attracted attention from secular authorities who wanted to replicate his methods, leading to the first recorded examples of monks serving as agricultural consultants to non-religious communities. Francis's approach was revolutionary because it treated practical expertise as a form of spiritual service. Instead of viewing worldly knowledge as a distraction from religious devotion, he argued that developing better farming techniques was actually a way of serving God by reducing human suffering and increasing prosperity. This theology of practical competence would eventually influence the Protestant work ethic and modern ideas about the relationship between material success and moral worth. Sister Margaret of Kemp emerged as a pioneer in what would now be called social entrepreneurship. After her convent was devastated by plague, Margaret organized the surviving nuns into a mobile medical mission that traveled between communities providing healthcare services. This wasn't traditional charitable work. It was a systematic attempt to create sustainable medical services in regions where traditional healthcare infrastructure had collapsed. Margaret's innovations included training laywomen in basic medical techniques, establishing networks of volunteer caregivers, and developing financing mechanisms that allowed poor communities to pay for medical services through labor exchanges rather than cash payments. Her work essentially created the first documented examples of community-based healthcare systems that operated independently of traditional medical or religious hierarchies. Perhaps most significantly, Margaret's medical missions were staffed primarily by women at a time when healthcare was dominated by male physicians and monks. Her success demonstrated that women could provide effective medical care, which gradually led to expanded roles for women in religious and medical institutions. This wasn't intentional feminism. It was practical necessity that accidentally advanced women's rights by demonstrating female competence in professional roles. Brother Jerome the Builder represented another new type of religious figure, the monk as technical innovator. Jerome had survived plague at a monastery that specialized in construction and engineering. Rather than rebuilding traditional monastic structures, he began designing new types of religious buildings that were more efficient, healthier, and better adapted to post-plague realities. Jerome's architectural innovations included improved ventilation systems that reduced disease transmission, modular designs that could be expanded or contracted based on community size, and multi-purpose buildings that could serve religious, educational, and economic functions simultaneously. His designs were copied throughout Europe and influenced the development of Renaissance architecture. However, some fundamental problems proved remarkably resistant to practical solutions, revealing that institutional innovation can't solve every challenge created by civilizational trauma. The psychological and spiritual wounds left by the plague experience continue to affect monastic communities for generations, creating ongoing issues that adaptation and reform couldn't address. The authority crisis that had begun during the theological meltdowns of the plague years never fully resolved. Even successful reformed monasteries struggled with questions about religious authority and spiritual legitimacy. If traditional practices could be abandoned for practical reasons, what prevented further changes that might compromise spiritual authenticity? The precedent of adaptation created ongoing pressure for additional reforms that made many monks uncomfortable. Recruitment remained a persistent challenge that threatened the long-term viability of reformed monasticism. Young people who had grown up during and after the plague were less likely to view monastic life as an attractive career option. They had witnessed the failure of traditional religious institutions to provide protection or meaningful guidance during crisis, which undermined the appeal of religious vocations. The communities that did attract new members often found that post-plague recruits had different expectations and motivations than traditional monks. Many were drawn to reformed monasticism for practical reasons, economic security, educational opportunities, or professional training, rather than spiritual calling. This created ongoing tensions between practical and spiritual priorities that were never fully resolved. Economic inequality between reformed monasteries created new forms of institutional competition and conflict. Successful communities that had adapted effectively often became wealthy and powerful, while less successful institutions struggled with poverty and irrelevance. This inequality contradicted traditional monastic values about humility and spiritual equality, creating ongoing moral dilemmas about the relationship between success and virtue. The integration of monasteries with secular society, which had been necessary for survival, created ongoing problems with maintaining religious identity and independence. Communities that became too involved in worldly affairs risked losing their distinctive spiritual character. Those that tried to maintain traditional separation often found themselves unable to compete economically or fulfill practical social functions. Compared to the monasticism that had existed before the Black Death, the reformed institutions that emerged were more flexible, more practical, and arguably more socially useful. But they were also less ambitious spiritually and less capable of maintaining the intellectual and cultural functions that had made traditional monastery centers of medieval civilization. The new monasticism was more democratic and egalitarian than its predecessor. Simplified hierarchies and practical focus created opportunities for advancement based on competence rather than social status or theological sophistication. Communities that had once been dominated by aristocratic abbots and scholarly elites began promoting monks based on practical skills and community contribution. However, this democratization came at the cost of intellectual sophistication and cultural achievement. Traditional monasteries had produced magnificent, illuminated manuscripts, complex theological treatises, and sophisticated artistic works because they had the resources and institutional stability to support long-term creative projects. Reformed monasteries focused on immediate practical needs, which left less time and energy for activities that didn't contribute directly to community survival. Compared to other European institutions that faced similar plague-related challenges, monasteries were actually relatively successful at adaptation and survival. Secular governments, universities, and craft guilds often collapsed entirely or underwent even more dramatic transformations. The fact that any form of monasticism survived at all represents a remarkable institutional achievement. The patterns of monastic adaptation were replicated in other religious traditions facing similar challenges. Jewish communities, Islamic institutions, and even Orthodox Christian monasteries in Eastern Europe developed comparable strategies for maintaining religious identity while adapting to practical necessities. This suggests that the monastic response to plague represented broader patterns of institutional adaptation rather than uniquely Christian solutions. Looking at modern parallels, the transformation of medieval monasticism resembles contemporary organizational changes in response to technological disruption or economic crisis. The strategies that successful monasteries used, simplification, specialization, integration with external communities, and focus on practical value, are similar to approaches used by modern institutions facing existential challenges. By the early 15th century, warning signs pointed to another major transformation coming for European monasticism, though this time the changes would be driven by success rather than catastrophe. The adapted monasticism that had emerged from plague necessity had become so practical, so integrated with secular society, and so focused on worldly effectiveness that it was gradually losing the distinctive characteristics that had made it recognizably monastic in the first place. The irony was perfect in that uniquely medieval way where solutions create bigger problems than the original crisis. Reformed monasteries had become so good at adapting to practical necessities that they were accidentally transforming into something completely different, essentially religious institutions that were becoming less religious and more institutional. It was like watching a survival expert become so focused on not dying that they forgot what they were trying to stay alive for. Key players could see some of these changes coming, but they consistently misunderstood what they were observing. Abbot Geoffrey of St. Albans wrote extensively about his concerns that monasteries were becoming too worldly, but he interpreted this as a moral failing rather than an inevitable consequence of the adaptive strategies that had saved monasticism from extinction. He was essentially complaining that the medicine was working too well, without recognizing that the patient had fundamentally changed. Other observers focused on symptoms rather than causes. Brother William of Malmesbury worried that young monks were more interested in agricultural innovation than theological study, but he failed to recognize that this shift was a direct result of recruiting strategies that had prioritized practical skills over spiritual calling. Communities that had survived by emphasizing competence over contemplation were naturally attracting people who valued competence over contemplation. Resistance to inevitable change came from multiple directions, each representing different aspects of traditional monasticism that people were reluctant to abandon. Theological conservatives argued that any further changes would complete the destruction of authentic religious life that the plague had begun. Practical reformers worried that reversing successful adaptations would lead to institutional collapse. Secular authorities wanted to preserve the economic and social benefits they had gained from Reformed monasticism. Perhaps most significantly, many monks had developed professional identities and personal investments in a transformed system that made change personally threatening. Brother Francis, the agricultural consultant, had built his entire career around expertise that traditional monasticism didn't value. Sister Margaret's medical missions had created networks of relationships and responsibilities that extended far beyond traditional monastic boundaries. Abandoning reform practices would have meant abandoning not just institutional approaches, but personal identities and professional achievements. The end of plague era monasticism didn't come through dramatic collapse or sudden institutional failure. It came through a gradual transformation so subtle that contemporaries barely noticed it was happening. By the mid-15th century, many institutions that still called themselves monasteries had become something fundamentally different. Religious-flavored organizations that provided social services, operated businesses, and maintained spiritual practices as one function among many, rather than as their primary purpose. The transformation accelerated when Reformed monasteries began competing directly with secular institutions rather than complementing them. Monastic schools started competing with universities for students and funding. Monastic hospitals competed with secular medical practitioners. Monastic agricultural operations competed with commercial farms. This competition forced further adaptations that moved monasteries even further from traditional religious models. The most successful monasteries often looked more like modern corporations with religious branding than like traditional spiritual communities. They had professional management structures, specialized departments, strategic planning processes, and performance metrics that would have been comprehensible to modern business consultants, but incomprehensible to medieval monks from before the plague. Individual communities faced different versions of the same basic dilemma: maintain authentic religious identity at the cost of practical effectiveness, or maintain practical effectiveness at the cost of authentic religious identity. Most chose effectiveness, which was probably the right decision for institutional survival, but the wrong decision for maintaining monastic character. The final major players in this transformation were often people who had never intended to revolutionize monasticism, but found themselves managing institutions that bore little resemblance to their original spiritual calling. Abbot Thomas of Westminster spent his final years running what was essentially a medieval corporation that happened to own churches and employ people who happened to take religious vows. The dramatic final moments varied by institution, but they often involved formal decisions to abandon traditional practices that had become purely ceremonial. The Abbey of Cluny officially simplified its prayer schedule in 1456, eliminating the last remnants of the elaborate liturgical practices that had once defined monastic life. Other communities made similar decisions about charitable obligations, educational functions, and economic activities. The symbolic endpoints were usually mundane rather than dramatic. The last traditional Benedictine community in England quietly merged with a reformed house in 1463. The final unreformed Cistercian monastery in France converted to new practices in 1471. These weren't dramatic collapses. They were quiet, administrative decisions that marked the end of a form of religious life that had existed for over 1,000 years. The transformation occurred because plague-era adaptations had created momentum toward further change that became impossible to reverse without destroying the institutional benefits that adaptation had achieved. Reformed monasticism was simply too successful at serving practical needs to maintain the impractical aspects of traditional spiritual life. Internal contradictions made the old system unsustainable. Communities couldn't simultaneously maintain traditional spiritual practices and fulfill the practical obligations that had become essential for their survival and social relevance. The time, energy, and resources required for elaborate traditional ceremonies competed directly with the demands of running schools, hospitals, farms, and other practical enterprises. External pressures from secular authorities, local communities, and economic realities made maintaining traditional practices increasingly difficult. Monasteries that tried to retreat from worldly engagement found themselves losing political support, economic resources, and social relevance. Those that maintained worldly engagement found themselves becoming worldly institutions that happened. To include religious elements taught the generational factor was crucial, but often overlooked. Monks who had experienced traditional monasticism before the plague gradually died off, leaving communities dominated by people whose entire religious experience had been shaped by reform practices. For these monks, adapted monasticism wasn't a compromise with traditional ideals. It was the only form of monastic life they had ever known. Economic incentives consistently favored further adaptation and secularization. Communities that became more businesslike were more profitable. Those that became more integrated with secular society received more support from political authorities. Those that focused on practical services attracted more resources and recruits than those that maintained purely spiritual functions. What could have been done differently is a complex question that historians still debate. Some argue that monasticism could have maintained more traditional characteristics while adapting to practical necessities. Others contend that the transformation was inevitable given the magnitude of social and economic changes triggered by the plague. The role of individual decision-makers versus broader historical forces remains unclear. Strong leaders who were committed to maintaining traditional practices might have slowed the transformation, but they probably couldn't have prevented it entirely. The practical pressures that drove adaptation were too strong, and the benefits of change were too obvious for institutional leaders to ignore indefinitely. The immediate aftermath of traditional monasticism's end was a period of institutional confusion and identity crisis that lasted for several generations. Communities that had completed the transformation to reform practices were successful and stable, but they struggled with questions about what made them distinctively religious rather than simply socially useful. Many former monasteries became proto-Protestant institutions decades before the Protestant Reformation officially began. They maintained Christian identity and religious practices, but they had abandoned most of the theological and institutional characteristics that had defined medieval Catholicism. This created unofficial religious pluralism within officially Catholic societies, which contributed to the intellectual and religious climate that would eventually make the Protestant Reformation possible. Secular authorities, who had grown accustomed to working with practical, business-like religious institutions, found themselves with enhanced power and reduced ecclesiastical interference in political affairs. The traditional balance between religious and secular authority had shifted decisively towards secular control, often without anyone making conscious decisions about constitutional or political theory. Local communities that had benefited from Reformed monastic services faced new challenges when former monasteries continued evolving away from charitable obligations toward purely commercial operations. The social safety net that adapted monasticism had provided was gradually disappearing, but no alternative institutions had developed to replace it. Contemporary actions varied widely and often reflected confusion about what had actually happened. Some observers celebrated the increased practical effectiveness of reformed religious institutions. Others mourned the loss of traditional spiritual practices and worried about the long-term consequences of secularizing religious life. The most perceptive contemporary analysts recognized that the transformation represented something much larger than simple institutional reform. They understood that the relationship between spiritual and worldly concerns had fundamentally changed in ways that would affect all aspects of European society. However, even these observers underestimated the long-term implications of what they were witnessing. Attempts at revival or continuation of traditional monasticism were sporadic and generally unsuccessful. Communities that tried to return to pre-plague practices often found themselves unable to attract recruits, maintain economic viability, or fulfill the social functions that had become expected of religious institutions. The world had changed too much for traditional monasticism to be viable, regardless of its spiritual merits. The legacy of monastic transformation during the Black Death shaped virtually every aspect of later European development in ways that most people never recognize, like invisible architectural supports that hold up buildings without anyone noticing they're there. The practical adaptations that had seemed like temporary emergency measures during the plague years became permanent changes that influenced everything from the Protestant Reformation to the development of modern capitalism, often in ways that would have horrified the monks who made the original adaptations. The most significant long-term influence was the precedent that religious institutions could and should change their practices based on practical necessity rather than theological tradition. This was a revolutionary concept that undermined the entire medieval assumption that religious truth was eternal and unchanging. Once monks had demonstrated that spiritual practices could be modified for practical reasons, it became much easier for later reformers to argue that other aspects of religious life could also be changed. Martin Luther's arguments about reforming the Catholic Church drew heavily on examples from Reformed monasticism, though he probably didn't realize it. When Luther argued that religious institutions should focus on practical service rather than elaborate ceremonies, he was essentially advocating for approaches that plague-era monks had already implemented. The Protestant emphasis on practical piety over ritualistic observance had direct roots in monastic adaptations that had occurred 2 centuries earlier. The development of modern, secular institutions was profoundly influenced by the organizational innovations of Reformed monasteries. Hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations that emerged during the Renaissance and early modern period were often based on models that had been pioneered by adaptive monastic communities. The idea that institutions should be evaluated based on their practical effectiveness rather than their traditional prestige was a monastic innovation that became a foundational principle of modern organizational theory. Economic historians trace the origins of certain capitalist practices to reformed monastic communities that had been forced to develop innovative financial instruments, labor management techniques, and market strategies during their post-plague recovery. The Protestant work ethic that Max Weber identified as crucial to capitalist development had medieval precedents in the practical theology that Reformed monks had developed to justify their focus on worldly effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, the monastic experience during the Black Death provided a template for how traditional institutions could survive existential crises through radical adaptation. This template would be used repeatedly throughout European history by universities, governments, churches, and other institutions facing revolutionary changes. The basic strategy: simplify operations, focus on practical value, integrate with external communities, and abandon traditional practices that no longer serve functional purposes, became a standard approach to institutional reform. The intellectual legacy was equally profound, but more subtle. Reformed monasticism had demonstrated that traditional authorities could be wrong about fundamental questions, that practical experience could trump theoretical knowledge, and that survival sometimes required abandoning cherished beliefs. These insights contributed to the intellectual climate that eventually produced the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Today, we can see echoes of the monastic plague experience in virtually every major institutional crisis of the modern era, from corporate restructuring during economic downturns to university adaptations during technological disruption. The patterns are remarkably consistent across time periods and institutional types, suggesting that humans have a limited repertoire of responses to existential organizational challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic provided particularly striking parallels to the medieval monastic experience. Religious institutions worldwide face similar dilemmas about maintaining traditional practices while adapting to health necessities. Churches that insisted on continuing traditional services suffered high infection rates, while those that adapted to remote services survived, but faced questions about the authenticity of virtual religious experience. Modern hospitals during pandemic conditions faced choices remarkably similar to those of medieval monasteries during plague outbreaks. Healthcare workers had to choose between maintaining ideal patient care standards and protecting their own safety and institutional capacity. The ethical dilemmas were essentially identical, though the technological context was obviously different. Educational institutions during lockdowns experienced a version of the same authority crisis that had affected plague-era monasteries. When traditional classroom instruction became impossible, schools and universities had to rapidly develop new approaches to education that maintain educational value while adapting to practical constraints. Students and parents questioned whether remote learning was real education, just as medieval laypeople had questioned whether simplified monastic practices were real religious life. Corporate responses to economic disruption often follow the same pattern as monastic adaptation. Companies facing existential threats typically simplify operations, focus on core functions, abandon traditional practices that don't contribute directly to survival, and integrate more closely with external stakeholders. The language is different, but the strategic choices are remarkably similar. The technology industry provides particularly clear examples of institutions abandoning traditional practices for practical advantages. Tech companies that have disrupted traditional industries, from retail to transportation to media, have essentially followed the reform monasticism playbook: focus on practical effectiveness over traditional prestige, simplify operations for maximum efficiency, and prioritize user value over institutional tradition. Social movements and political organizations facing crisis often adapt using strategies that parallel monastic transformation. Activist groups, political parties, and advocacy organizations that survive major defeats or changes in social conditions typically do so by simplifying their goals, focusing on practical achievements, and adapting their methods to new realities, rather than maintaining traditional approaches that no longer work. Even modern religious institutions continue to face versions of the same challenges that confronted plague-era monasteries. Declining attendance, reduced financial support, and competition from secular alternatives force contemporary churches to choose between maintaining traditional practices and adapting to modern realities. The debates about contemporary religious reform often use arguments that would be familiar to 14th century monks. Even now, the transformation of medieval monasticism influences contemporary discussions about institutional change, religious authority, and the relationship between tradition and adaptation. Academic studies of organizational behavior frequently reference the monastic experience as a case study in successful institutional adaptation, though they often miss the spiritual and cultural costs of the transformation. Modern management theory has adopted many principles that were pioneered by reformed monasteries, often without recognizing their historical origins. The emphasis on flat organizational structures, practical competence over formal credentials, and integration with external communities all have medieval precedents in post-plague monastic adaptation. Contemporary religious debates about tradition versus modernization often replay arguments that began during the monastic transformation of the 14th and 15th centuries. Progressive religious leaders advocate for practical adaptation, using reasoning that would be familiar to reformed medieval monks, while traditionalists argue for maintaining established practices using logic that medieval conservatives had employed. The questions that plague era monks faced about the relationship between spiritual authenticity and practical effectiveness remain central to modern discussions about institutional purpose and organizational ethics. Corporations struggle with balancing profit maximization and social responsibility. Universities debate academic excellence versus practical utility. Nonprofit organizations balance idealistic goals with realistic capabilities. Political institutions continue to grapple with the same fundamental tension that destroyed traditional monasticism: the need to maintain legitimacy and identity while adapting to changing practical requirements. Democratic governments, international organizations, and political movements all face versions of the choice between authentic representation of traditional values and effective response to contemporary challenges. The psychological and cultural impacts of the monastic transformation continue to influence European and Western attitudes toward institutional authority, religious truth, and the relationship between individual and community obligations. The individualistic tendencies that characterize modern Western culture have roots in the institutional failures and adaptations of the late medieval period. Popular culture references to medieval monasticism often unconsciously reflect the post-plague transformation rather than traditional monastic life. Modern images of monks as practical, world-engaged, and focused on social service are more accurate descriptions of reformed monasticism than of the elaborate, world-separated, ceremonially focused traditional monasticism that existed before the Black Death. Academic disciplines including sociology, organizational psychology, religious studies, and management science continue to mine the monastic experience for insights about institutional change, crisis management, and the relationship between values and practical effectiveness. The medieval monastic transformation remains one of the best documented cases of large-scale institutional adaptation in human history. Why people still care about this 700-year-old story reflects its continuing relevance to fundamental questions about how institutions should respond to existential challenges, how communities should balance tradition with adaptation, and how individuals should navigate the tension between personal values and practical necessities. The monks who lived through the Black Death faced versions of these questions in their most extreme form, and their responses continue to provide insights for anyone dealing with institutional crisis or fundamental change. Looking back across the tumultuous century from 1347 to 1450, we've seen medieval monasticism undergo a transformation so complete that it essentially became a different institution entirely while maintaining the same name, like watching your local library gradually become a tech startup while still calling itself a library. The major themes that emerged from this journey reveal patterns about human adaptability, institutional survival, and the complex relationship between spiritual ideals and practical necessities that remain relevant centuries later. The key patterns we've observed include the tendency for institutions to prioritize survival over authenticity during existential crises, the inevitability of unintended consequences when emergency measures become permanent policies, and the surprising fragility of systems that appear permanent and divinely sanctioned. Medieval monasticism seemed like one of the most stable institutions in human history until it wasn't. Perhaps most surprising was discovering how quickly and completely the elaborate theological and ceremonial systems that had defined monasticism for over 800 years could be abandoned when they became obstacles to survival. The monks who simplified prayer schedules, streamlined charitable obligations, and focused on practical effectiveness weren't trying to revolutionize Christianity. They were just trying to stay alive and maintain their communities. But their practical adaptations ended up changing the fundamental nature of religious life in ways that influenced everything from the Protestant Reformation to modern capitalism. The most important takeaway might be that the difference between temporary emergency measures and permanent institutional change often comes down to whether the emergency ends quickly enough for people to remember what normal used to look like. The Black Death lasted long enough and killed enough people that the adaptations necessary for survival became the new normal, even after the immediate crisis had passed. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reflects the complexity of evaluating historical change while it's happening versus analyzing it with centuries of hindsight. The monks living through these experiences couldn't see the broader patterns or long-term implications of their decisions. They were focused on immediate survival, practical problems, and maintaining some version of their religious identity, while everything they had believed about divine protection and spiritual authority collapsed around them. Modern historians can see the transformation of medieval monasticism as part of broader patterns of institutional adaptation, religious change, and social evolution that the participants couldn't have recognized. This doesn't make the historical actors naive or short-sighted. It just highlights how difficult it is to understand the significance of events while you're living through them. Brother Thomas of Walsingham, whom we met at the beginning of this journey, provides a perfect final anecdote that encapsulates everything we've discussed about the transformation of medieval monasticism. Thomas survived not just the plague itself, but the complete transformation of his religious community from a traditional Benedictine monastery into something that resembled a medieval social services agency with religious characteristics docked by. 1,333 years after the plague had first arrived at Walsingham, Thomas was serving as prior of a community that bore little resemblance to the monastery he had joined as a young man. Instead of the 67 monks who had once lived there, the community consisted of 12 monks who spent most of their time managing agricultural operations, running a school for local children, and providing medical services to surrounding villages. Thomas's final chronicle entries reveal a man who had made peace with the transformation, even though he never fully understood how it had happened. "We are no longer the community I joined," he wrote in 1381, "but we are still serving God, though in ways our founders never imagined." Perhaps this is what adaptation means, becoming something different while remaining somehow true to our original purpose. The most revealing detail in Thomas's final writings is his description of training his successor. Instead of teaching elaborate ceremonial procedures, complex theological concepts, or traditional monastic disciplines, Thomas spent months showing the younger monk how to manage crop rotations, negotiate with local merchants, organize educational curricula, and maintain medical supplies. The skill set required for leading a post-plague monastery was completely different from what had been needed before 1347. What this story reveals about the broader themes is that successful adaptation often requires individuals to accept that Their institutions will become something fundamentally different from what they originally joined or believed in. Thomas never stopped being a monk, but he had to accept that being a monk in 1380 meant something completely different from being a monk in 1340. How it connects to everything we've discussed is that Thomas's experience represents thousands of similar stories across medieval Europe. Individuals who navigated institutional transformation while maintaining personal identity and purpose. The larger historical patterns we've analyzed were made up of countless individual decisions by people like Thomas, who were trying to balance competing values, practical necessities, and institutional loyalties. The memorable final image that emerges from Thomas's story is of an elderly monk teaching agricultural techniques to his successor while sitting in a chapel that had been built for elaborate ceremonial worship that no longer occurred. It's a perfect metaphor for the transformation of medieval monasticism. Traditional spaces being used for new purposes, knowledge being passed down that previous generations never needed, and continuity maintained through adaptation rather than preservation. The transformation of medieval monasticism during and after the Black Death offers profound insights about how institutions survive existential challenges, though not always informs that their founders would recognize or approve of. The monks who lived through this experience demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, even when adaptation required abandoning almost everything that had previously defined their institutional identity. Their story reminds us that survival and authenticity are often competing values that can't be maximized simultaneously. The monasteries that maintained traditional practices most faithfully often died out entirely, while those that adapted most successfully became something fundamentally different from what they had been. There's no obvious moral lesson here, just the recognition that institutional change during crisis involves trade-offs that resist easy evaluation. Perhaps the most important insight from this medieval experience is that people are remarkably capable of adapting to circumstances that would have seemed impossible to previous generations, while maintaining enough continuity to preserve some sense of identity and purpose. The monks of 1400 were still recognizably monks, even though they lived and worked in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the monks of 1300. This suggests that human institutions possess more flexibility and resilience than their formal structures and official ideologies would suggest. When circumstances require fundamental change, people find ways to maintain meaning and purpose, even while abandoning practices and beliefs that had previously seemed essential. And the gentle conclusion that emerges from this long journey through medieval institutional transformation is that adaptation and continuity aren't opposite forces. They're complementary strategies that institutions use to maintain relevance and meaning across changing circumstances. The monks who successfully navigated the Black Death and its aftermath weren't betraying their religious heritage. They were finding new ways to live out ancient commitments to service, community, and spiritual growth. As we reflect on their experience from our modern perspective, we can appreciate both their resilience in adapting to unprecedented challenges and their success in maintaining institutional continuity across one of the most disruptive periods in European history. Their story offers hope that contemporary institutions facing similar existential challenges might also find ways to adapt and survive while maintaining their essential purposes and values. The peaceful closing thought that emerges from contemplating the monastic experience during the Black Death is that human beings possess remarkable capacity for creating meaning and maintaining community even during periods of catastrophic change. The specific forms that institutions take may be temporary, but the human needs for purpose, belonging, and service that institutions serve appear to be permanent features of human nature that will find expression regardless of external circumstances. In the end, the story of medieval monks during the Black Death is really a story about human adaptability, institutional resilience, and the complex relationship between tradition and change that continues to shape our world today. Their experience reminds us that even the most devastating crises can become opportunities for renewal and growth, though usually not in ways that anyone could have anticipated or planned.